I'm Pastor Marge. I'm the Director for Evangelical Mission in the Synod. I see some folks that I haven't met yet, so that's really cool. And we started a series called Coming Out of Pandemic. This is our third of 4 sessions. So the first one was a kind of grand idea of what are we learning and what do you think God is up to and how are we going to build on that. That in that conversation had some underlayings of concern / anxiety about how to continue doing online and also return to physical worship or some version of on-site worship without getting exhausted because you're trying to do two things that both take a huge amount of energy and time. We all have massive amounts of pandemic fatigue. So in the interest of not exhausting anybody and returning to some sort of semblance of Sabbath and rest, I thought we should have some more conversations about this. So we had the USC one a couple weeks back with Thriving Congregations on Technology and Innovation. And there were about 16 of us that joined that conversation. And then today, about the time I realized this is what we really needed, my friend Dave Daubert, who's a colleague from Churchwide, wrote a book called Becoming a Hybrid Congregation. And I said, probably should read that. And so I did, and then called Dave, and he said he'd be happy to come talk to you. He is an author, a pastor, he's on contract consultant with Churchwide. He can tell you a little bit more about himself, but we're not assuming that you've read the book. We're just assuming that you're interested in the topic. And if you want to read the book together, we can certainly do that a different way. I can, email me. I'll put my email in the chat, and we can set up a different sort of way to go through the book. Next week is Ryan Panzer, who wrote a book called Grace in Gigabytes. So I hope you'll come for that one too. They're very different, the two books. Dave's is more written for from the viewpoint of inside a congregation. So you're a pastor, you have these ministry teams, worship team, the stewardship team, the evangelism team, These are the questions these committees might want to think about as you move into a hybrid concept. Ryan, I keep calling him Randy. Ryan's book is more of a, here's the culture outside the church, and this is how technology has shaped it in terms of how it asks questions, how it collaborates, how it creates, how it communicates. And so it's two different viewpoints, internal, external, on sort of the same scenario. So I think they're both really helpful. So I hope you'll do this next week too. Anyway, right now though, I'm just going to introduce you to Dave, and he's going to do about, I don't know, what do you do, about 20 minutes of a presentation with some slides. And then we can decide then if we want to stay in one big group or split into two, kind of just to process it, but also to think of questions. You can verbalize the questions out loud by unmuting yourself or put them in the chat, and I will watch for them there. And so we can kind of play that by ear a little bit, right? Okay. Great. So there you go, Dave.
Great. Thanks, Marge. And thanks to all of you for taking an hour out of your day to have this conversation. We did this earlier in the day with another group, and I heard some things in different ways and stuff. So whenever I do one of these things, I like to thank the group, because I learn in every one of these conversations on this. People are, I'm really not an expert at this as much as a inquisitive practitioner, if that makes sense. And I was a pastor for a long time, but I was an engineer before that. I'm not afraid of technology. I'm intrigued by technology. And so the questions and the environment that we're in are places I'm semi-competent. There are way more competent people than I am. But in the span of the church, I'm in the top 10 percentile of pastors anyway, at being able to do stuff. So there's things that I can look at and things that I'm curious about where I've actually had a lot of fun. And thought, well, gee, I'm learning a lot. Maybe something that I'm learning I could share with other people. And mostly then as I talk to people, you're learning a lot. And some of you have thought of things that didn't cross my mind, like, wow, that's a great idea. I wonder why it took me so long to hear that one. That's brilliant. And so forth. So I would want to just say, thank you for your ministry. And as we talk, that's going to be helpful. I'm going to share my screen and show well under half hour, 20 minutes or so of slides just to kind of lay some things out. Hopefully they're helpful at framing some things, and maybe also at sparking some of your imagination. And then we've got 3 questions that will shape our time. And with this many people, as Marge said, we can decide whether to stay in one large group or maybe break into 2 or 3 groups or something for breakouts. We'll see. And we'll leave that somewhat up to you. So I'm going to share my screen and begin. Let me move this so I can see. And there's my email address. If after this is over, you got a question or a challenge or an idea or a comment, email me. I'm pretty good about responding. And sometimes I screw up if I see it on my phone and then think, oh, that's going to be a longer answer. I should get back to it later, but it's been highlighted different that I've read it. I sometimes miss things. So don't feel that if I didn't answer that you shouldn't send me something twice. After twice, I'm probably just being a jerk and not answering, but it's not on purpose. Sometimes I just don't see things. So please interact. There's my website as well. And if you're interested in a book, it's available on the website. I don't have capacity this week to do bulk orders, which are a little more off, but I will next week again. I'm in right in the line between my second and third printing on this, and we're getting ready to warehouse a new printing, but we're down to under 100 copies available. So I can't send bulk orders till next week when the next shipment of books comes in. But there's other things there, some of them Lutheran Trump Cards, which is kind of a catechism, Invitational Christian, which I wrote. I'm working on an addendum, post-pandemic addendum to the Invitational Christian, which will be like a free PDF to add to it. Living Lutheran, somebody may have seen, I wrote that 15 years ago now, which is a little scary. So having said that, I want to kind of dig into a couple things. And I think it's really important to always think, regardless of what our contextual uniqueness might be at any given moment, that the mission of God is still calling the church to be participating in the announcing, inbreaking, glimpsing, already not yetness of the kingdom of God, the reign of God. So I've got a few passages here that just will remind us of this. You'll receive power when the Holy Spirit has come upon you, and you'll be my witnesses in Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and to the ends of the earth. This hasn't changed. How we do it might have changed, and how we reach the ends of the earth is radically different with internet than it was in the first century when this was said. This Easter text that was many of our lectionaries just a few weeks ago, Jesus said to them again, peace be with you, as the Father has sent me, so I send you. When he said this, he breathed on them and said to them, receive the Holy Spirit. If you forgive the sins of any, they're forgiven them. If you retain the sins of any, they're retained. This is still true. And I could list the Great Commission, or 2 Corinthians 5 is one of my chapters that I really love, that God was reconciling the world to himself and ambassadors for Christ. I love the Luke 4 text, and the Spirit of the Lord is upon me, and the Isaiah quoting. The mission of God and the way it's laid out in Scripture is rich and multifaceted and vibrant, and those are still our grounding. At the same time, congregations really need to be committed to inward and outward development. And when I first started the ELCA, I thought congregations were too inward focused, and really worked hard to get as congregational training out and engaging their community. And that was correct in one sense, that they needed to be more engaged in their community. But I kind of learned in the process that I was incorrect about the inward, that people really weren't necessarily cultivating and developing capacity to love and be loved more, or deepening their faith, or working on collectively being the body of Christ in ways that would lead towards being more Christ-like and embodying the Christ in our collective identity better. Outward focus was not preparing people to live out their vocations when they were together in church, so they could leave the church and be mobilized, not just in church programs, which might be important in some cases, but as the feet, hands, and voice of Christ at work, or in their families, or wherever they might find themselves. So I've kind of learned long-term, both of these require more intentionality than I was thinking 20 years ago when I was starting to mess with these things. This all kind of came to a head last year at Easter, and the cancellation of Easter, at least on the ground stuff, was big news. And there was controversy about whether the government could tell people they couldn't come together for Easter, and all kinds of stuff when churches decided not to gather physically for Easter. And we got more press last Easter because we didn't gather physically, and ABC, NBC, Fox, and MSNBC, opposite ends of the kind of news spectrum, were all talking, what is the church going to do? And there was even quite a few Passover stories. Jewish people got more outreach kind of press last year than they've probably ever gotten in the history of the United States. And we know, because we didn't gather, that, and this is a data-driven reality, that more people heard the gospel preached in some form Easter 2020 than on any other day in the history of the planet. And sadly, or for whatever reasons, that's actually still true. Easter 2021 was not a big splash. Nobody was running on adrenaline and excited. And so it was a big splash, and a lot happened, but it happened because we had to. And if we had had the pandemic shut down in June, July, during the summer slump on the 9th Sunday after Pentecost, I have a hard time imagining the same kind of adrenaline rush for everybody mobilized saying, well, we can't have the 9th Sunday of Pentecost canceled. We've got to do something. We've got to get online the way Easter would have. But because we had enough time, 3 or 4 weeks before Easter, to do something, and enough angst and adrenaline to do something, the church really was quite responsive and did a lot of things. And it really shows how much easier it is to adapt when you have no choice. And so a lot of people thought they were being adaptive. They're probably being more reactive. And now we're entering a piece of time when we've got to deal with the long-term realities, both what we've inherited from our past behaviors and what we're creating with our future behaviors, because the pandemic didn't really break our system. It really just showed all sorts of things that were happening. And a lot of people think in some ways what it did is it forced the church to start thinking about things it would have maybe not gotten to till 2030 in many places. We were just all forced to deal with them in 2020. Not because we couldn't have dealt with them in 2020 anyway, but because we would not have dealt with them without that kind of external contextual change. So that's really why we wrote this church book, Becoming a Hybrid Church. And as Marge said, this book, and whether you use this or anything else, I think one of the things that's really important, it's almost impossible to have adaptive change take place in a congregation or make significant shifts in how you even do technical implementation if you don't have good questions and foster good discussion. And so this book kind of walks through a variety of areas of church ministry, and at the end has questions to reflect on. But whether you use this or whatever you're using, I think getting people talking about good questions is one of the key benefits leaders bring. And adaptive leaders ask good questions and help people wrestle with them rather than provide answers for those people. I was just talking to somebody in the last conversation in the last hour, and he said he's just going to call a pastor who found out he didn't get a call. And in the letter saying why they didn't give him the call, this is actually in writing. The person who wrote the letter said on behalf of the congregation, if we'd wanted a pastor who would help us be better Christians, we probably would have called you. And so that's an interesting statement. And I don't know what it means completely, but the person I was talking to, who, like Marge, is a DEM, was puzzling over that and wanted to get more about what was behind it. But people don't readily explore transformation and newness without owning it and participating in it. And so that's really part of the philosophy that I work. The other thing is you can't go back. And there's a lot of us. We're going to go back to the building. We're going to go back to whatever. You can only go forward. And I believe we're in one of the most vibrant, imaginative, opportunity-filled windows that has probably existed in our lifetime or may ever exist in our lifetime, depending on what happens. Never has the church been required in our lifetime to stop doing everything the way it did it, and then pause long enough to then put things back or forward and have as much freedom as we have to not do it the way we did it. And not even to do what we did, that we could actually have new priorities and stop doing things that were sucking a lot of energy from us. And we could reimagine in some dramatic ways what it means for us to be church. So one of the things that I talked about last week with the Conference of Bishops that really bore out quite a bit of conversation, so I've added it to the conversations, that I think good leadership in a time like this is keeping that window open longer. We've got a window of opportunity. And the angst in the system, some of it's ours, if we're honest. I mean, I've got a lot of angst about workload, and we've done a great job at recording services. Now we're going to be back on the ground, and do I have to do recorded and on the ground, and the multiple venues of participating in worship and the multiple formats and ways of doing it, and getting my sermon recorded by Thursday, but still preaching that one on Sunday. And it's just a lot of angst. And there's also just that nostalgic longing that people have in general, and church people are certainly high on the scale of nostalgia. People just like going back to what was in security almost always if they felt like it was okay. So a lot of people will settle for okay over ideal because okay is known and ideal is not guaranteed anyway. So there's just this sense that I know what it was. And the reality, though, is the less that we've carried over in the last year, particularly in how we've done things, and then the more freedom we have to decide how to put it back in place or eliminate it going forward and put something else instead. And that's, I think, really important. I'm really encouraging people to imagine longer and implement slower. As a general rule, imagine longer and implement slower going back into physical space, and assess each step. You do not have to go, oh, we're back on the ground. We should start all our programs back up. No, it might be that you should not start all your programs back up even ever. So go slow and assess each thing and say, is this what we're called to do? Is this how we're called to do it? If nobody missed it for the last 15 months, could we stop and make energy and space for something else? What would the something else be? And reimagine the big picture of our church, why and how it does its things, and then the medium-sized stuff of building priorities, and then the micro stuff of actually implementing things. It takes a long time for imagination to embed in community. Requires a lot of interaction and questions and listening. And if people don't have time to do that, if we rush out of anxiety to solving it quickly, almost always the solution we come up with is less imaginative. So I think networking and connecting and relationships are the heart of the church, and they will continue to be, and those have only expanded. This is my second conversation with groups in California today. I've talked to people in Colorado and Pennsylvania, and I don't even remember where else, Illinois. And those expanded relationships are often very fruitful and pretty exciting. So that's not going to change, but our opportunity to say, boy, fruitful networked relationships could be totally different. And our dependence on ourselves and our own stuff can be at an all-time low because we can share at a way like never before. So I'm hoping that one of the changes that comes out of this and that we are imagining is that we stop seeing each congregation as a franchise of the ELCA, but really more and more a connected part of a movement, and that we help each other and imagine working together, collaboration and thinking conceptually as well as implementation and sharing programmatically, I think could be radically different. And if we take this time, the hybrid model actually allows us to rethink both the scale of our ministry and the place and how we take place together in this next chapter of our church. So one of the things I know causes a lot of angst for me is that hybrid solutions mean both online and on the ground options matter. And if I don't have the wisdom to say which one here or how do they interface, what happens is I just start adding things. And it's easy to add because it doesn't cause stress for people who have to stop doing something to be offended and grieve. But it's difficult to add because it leads to just over-functioning and a system that can't sustain its own capacity. So you can't just add. And doing both doesn't mean doing more of both. It also means interfacing them wisely. And one of the real keys in being a hybrid church is having the wisdom to say, okay, what are we trying to accomplish here? Who needs to be involved, and how wide could we make that circle in a way that makes sense? And then how do we have those conversations happen? And how does technology fit into that in a way that would make it easier? And how does being in the same space fit into that in a way that would make it more intimate, or whatever those things are? And which should we use here and why? That's a wisdom question. We've got people doing new things that have never done them. To say, well, we don't have to meet online anymore because the pandemic's over would be almost criminal, because we would be just disconnecting all kinds of things. But at the same time, some people will be in the building. Do we make everybody come? Do we outfit a room with a hybrid, with new cameras and good microphone systems so people can actually see and hear? Are we willing to spend $1,000 to have a classroom be different? All those kind of questions start to come up. When you do both, and I'm thinking about a hybrid piece, I'm doing an interim at a neighboring congregation. They're doing hybrid church council meetings poorly. And I've only been there a couple of months. So last month's was better than the months before because we tried some things that made them better, but people couldn't see each other. They weren't all on Zoom. There was 3/4 of the council was in the room physically, and the other quarter of the council was online. So we had like 8 or 9 people in the room and 4 people on Zoom. The Zoom people we could all hear because the speakers were good, but they couldn't hear the physical people. So I can't hear, I can't see. People weren't sure who was speaking from where and who's leading the conversation at any given time. And as a result, a congregation that I'm doing the interim at has a lot of angst in it. And that council meeting did not help because their inability to do just the basic things that they needed to have the conversation distracted them and frustrated them enough. So good conversations about hybrid reality sometimes require us to spend some money and do some work to make sure we have all the technical things in place, because you can't have a good adaptive conversation when everybody's frustrated that they can't, whatever. So you're going to have to invest. And this is, I think, a really important piece that takes a lot of time and energy to learn new things and to find out what capacities are. If you don't know the capacity of something, it's hard to imagine how it might impact your bigger picture and the vision. And it might take an investment of time and money. We're spending money to create a hybrid classroom in the building that I'm at. We had to upgrade our internet subscription to higher speed things to do certain things. So it costs short-term money of capital, takes a long-term, our monthly bills are higher. But the reality is no adaptive change is going to happen without certain technical implementation. You're going to have to do something. And no time has the church ever been more ripe for getting all kinds of new tools that people never knew even existed a year ago. I can't tell you how many people I know who said, I hadn't even heard of Zoom when this started, and now I use it all the time. And for those who aren't Zoom burned out, a lot of them are just amazed at the conversations they're having with friends or family or meetings or all kinds of things. So here's some things that I want to lay out before we come into our conversation. Number one, the question of live stream versus recording of worship. And then the real question, which isn't how to present it, but how do we cultivate a worship environment where people are actually engaged and interacting? And we've been using recorded worship pieces. We've got usually 19 segments that we record, we edit, we put in captions and lyrics and graphics and things. And our kind of presentation is pretty good. But if everybody just watches and doesn't engage, that's a problem. So we've been learning to ask questions. We've asked our staff. One of them is actually assigned to work 9:30 on Sundays now as a host and interact. We've taught our members to sign in actually in the comments to say, I'm here. And this is Dennis and Marge. They put more than one name on a screen name so we know the groups. It's taken a lot of training, but now our people are doing it on their own, and we can get comments and responses, and questions come out of sermons and we get responses in line. So engagement. We also know that now that we're coming back to on the ground worship, that if we keep recording, and I'm a half-time pastor, my wife's a half-time deacon, we've got part-time musicians and so forth. We don't have any full-time staff. We do not have the capacity in our system to do a good job at recording and do a good job on the ground and do much else that for the timeframes that so we're going to have to rethink how we do worship and go from worshiping with recording as our base for interacting, probably to live streaming. I mean, putting in new PTZ cameras and the software to multi-camera system, and then think about how it changes our liturgy to know that not everybody who's participating is in the room, and engage people who are participating online. A lot of new things to learn that I don't know yet. So I got another skill set, more angst. But the way we did it last September probably can't be the way we do it next September. Even the way we did it last September, I think, was correct. So that's the kind of fluidity we're in. And that's why it's important to keep those windows open. Other things are, we got meeting platforms. We can meet online. We can meet in the building on the ground. We can meet hybrid. What are we going to do? And how does this work for small groups, learning, leading, meeting, church councils, all kinds of stuff? How do we care for each other? A pastor on the first session said that pastor had visited somebody in hospital for the first time in a long time because they hadn't been able to be in the room with them. And this person's now near the end of life and had to make hospital call. How stressful and how much angst there was for going back into the hospital and seeing somebody who they hadn't seen. How do we do care, and how does technology fit into that? How does being in the same room matter, and so forth? And then the last thing I want to really lift up is that I'm seeing more and more and more thinking that if we're doing hybrid stuff, this is about our congregation. It's about us. And we're really losing ground across the church on community engagement. And I want to just keep reminding people that technology allows us not only to do things differently inside the church, but it allows us to interact with a larger segment of the outside world from outside the institutional church than ever before. And that the possibilities are amazing. I was listening to somebody on NPR this afternoon in the car, And it was a woman who was a mental health professional talking about what they'd done during the pandemic. And the interviewer asked her a question about what she had learned and what she thought would happen when the pandemic resided and decreased a little bit. And she said, well, I hope we keep using some of this because we've never had this kind of access to mental health services for low-income people who struggled with transportation and access in the communities, because we can meet with people in any zip code and they don't have to come to us. We can interact with them in whole new ways. And we're talking to people that have never had access to mental health. And it would be a shame now that they have it to take it away and make them have to figure out how to come to us again. Well, that's pretty amazing that in her mind, the ability to serve and connect and care for people who have been on a marginalized situation is radically different. And she's thinking of it as a justice issue. When you stop having this pandemic, whatever that means in the new reality, we can't take what we've learned and just ditch it all and go back to the way it was. It would actually be a crime. It would be a sin. So I want to finish with one comment about cooperation. I think a big part of this is cooperation. And this is just one example, but there's lots of ways to think about it. I live in a city of about 120,000 people with 4 ELCA congregations. So I just picked this number, and this isn't exactly what's happening, although certain parts of this are kind of in process. But before the pandemic, 4 congregations, 4 on the ground services, and each of them had their own pod of things. And each of them during Lent and Advent would do worship series on Wednesday nights, and they were poorly attended and they were getting smaller every year and bemoaning and worrying and wondering if they should keep doing it, but not able to stop because it wouldn't be Lent without it. Some of them have some small groups like women's circles or a Bible study group, and 2 of them still had adult Sunday school, some sort of education on Sunday mornings. 2 didn't, and all of them had a pastor, or in our case, it was a deacon. My wife does a weekday training that did some sort of class or Bible study. Now, imagine if the pandemic helped us to rethink ministry a bit at where we were at, and said, what if those 4 congregations didn't think of themselves as silos, as doing, but could be more collaborative? And they still do a weekly on-the-ground services in their physical spaces, but they have some sort of online worship each week that's only one, so that rather than all 4 congregations producing 4 different worship services, a lot of time, a lot of energy, they collaborate, share preaching and children's sermons and prayers, and put together a framework where they all participate every week in a different piece of it. But they all basically take care of a quarter of a service a week on average and share something that's collective and is put on by the collaborative Evangelical Lutheran Church America congregations of Elgin, Illinois, hypothetical. What a difference that would make in our terms of witness. And if somebody was connecting, they could have all kinds of links, and you wouldn't have to have 4 of these. And the labor, the sign of collaboration, what it means to be Lutheran in this community, a lot of things would be viewed differently. The 2 with adult Sunday school could continue, but Advent and Lent go online. Every one of these congregations had bigger Lents and Advents during the pandemic than they'd had in years. Well, now that we have no pandemic, should we go back to the one where people had to come and wouldn't, or should we think differently? And could we do this collaboratively? And the answer is, of course. In 2 of the places where there's a long tradition of soup lunches and stuff for groups of older people during the week, they might continue having Lenten lunches in 2 sites as a way to let people continue to physically gather because it's important. And then each of these congregations, rather than all 4 of them having something that's maybe similar, a lectionary-based Bible study or something, actually collaborate and strategize. And on Tuesday night, Pastor A offers a class that's lectionary-based Bible study. On Wednesday morning, Pastor B offers a class on spiritual practices for daily life. On Thursday afternoon, Pastor C offers a class on theology and dealing with current events. And on a Saturday morning or sometime, Pastor D offers something that rotates different topics. And you could even take turns being Pastor A, B, C, and D, depending for a while, and work on specialty. All of a sudden, these 4 small congregations with really limited educational opportunities and a lot of overlap, like we all do the lectionary Bible study or something, could have a curriculum and a faculty and be imaginative. And the pastors who are teaching could be freed up to teach classes that were unique and interesting for a time because there'd be other people covering that Bible study base or whatever they might be. And suddenly a congregation of 30 or 40 people with no real substance beyond what their own pastor can provide, who might be part-time, has a curriculum and a faculty and access to the same kinds of things that might be found in larger congregations because they've always had more time and money to do these things. So I really think small congregations and people who are wired for collegiality are really in a place to rethink, wow, what if I offered this class and the people over Christ the Lord and our people did this together? And then Phil offers a class over Christ the Lord and our people do it. And we each do the same amount of work, but we have twice as much offered to folks and twice as many ways to connect. The same thing is true for collaborating on service and working and all kinds of things. So this is where I'm going to stop, and I'm going to put the questions there like that for a second, and then I'm going to stop sharing. We'll put them in, but I want us to talk about three things. One, where's the anxiety in your system currently? And I think it's an important thing to include yourself. I certainly know that I've got lots of angst coming from various places, but sometimes the most anxious place in my system that I'm really aware of is myself, because I'm always aware of my own anxiety. Well, maybe not always, frequently aware of my own anxiety. So where is that in your system that makes you want to figure this out and solve this and move quicker? The second question is, what are some of the more imaginative ways being a hybrid congregation could or already has made a bigger adaptive shift about how you're thinking about how your congregation functions and how you're thinking about ministry in the church? So that kind of adaptive, imaginative question. And some of you have been working with this and probably have some cool things to share that are radically vision shifting even for us on this. And then the third question is, how do you foster the kind of dialogue that allows for adaptive thinking? How do you get people talking to each other and being willing to wrestle longer with a question rather than jump faster to an answer? So I'm going to stop sharing.
Wait.
And we'll put those questions in the piece. And Marge, how do you want to proceed?
Okay, so what I wanted to do is have everybody take a picture of those questions. So can you put it back to where that was the big screen so people can get better pictures than when?
Sure, I'll be glad to. That's a good idea, because if we're going to use breakout rooms, well, that's probably the best way.
Right. And so what I'm going to do is just put us in 2 breakout rooms and just, how is this hitting you in general? We don't have to do those 3 questions. They're great questions to consider as you move forward, whether we have time for all 3 of them today or not. But so the initial question, the breakout room, is just how are you responding to this? And then we can start with those. But let's just do we have about 20 minutes left. So
Marge,
yes.
I'm going to suggest, could we do 3 breakout rooms? There's 22 people. That'd be 11. It could get us down to like 7 in a group, which is a little better for, could we do 3?
I need a 3rd leader.
Oh, somebody willing to be a 3rd leader?
Somebody might be volunteering, but I can't see. So
speak audibly if you're willing to help be a leader in a 3rd group, just to foster the dialogue. You don't have to have any answers. Just read the questions.
Thomas or Caleb could do it.
Yeah, I
Did you just volunteer, Caleb?
Oh, no, I was raising my hand. I wrote down the questions as the slide was up. So
okay, great. I will do 3 with it'll be Caleb, me, and Dave. And just give me a second. I'm gonna try to do random and then just organize a couple things. So we'll do
no problem. And I'll leave this here so you can write them down. Take a picture with your camera phone, whatever works for you. That way, somebody in every group, surely you'll have the questions by now.
Okay, so Trinity Church and Caleb. That's Caleb. And then I need to move Trinity Church into here.
And yeah, don't be limited by the questions as much as hopefully they're helpful at generating things. But I think angst, imagination, and openness are 3 really important aspects of making those kind of shifts. So that's what I kind of chose for general topics. It's not exhaustive or maybe even the best, but it's the best I could think of at the time.
Okay. So I'm going to open a room and then try to figure out where I am. Oops. I think I just did. Did not mean to do that. No, okay.
And then how long will we be in rooms, Marge?
I was going to say like 10 minutes and then come back.
Okay.
Does that sound good?
And then we'll have some debriefing in larger pieces.
Yeah.
Okay. See you all in about 10 minutes.
Here we are, all together as we see.
Here we are. Well, we were scratching the surface of things in ours. We could have gone longer with different conversations. It'd be interesting to hear what people shared or what you just want to talk about. And in a sense, we've got maybe 10, 15 minutes left of this hour.
Yeah.
And How do you want to move ahead,
and
Marge?
we just really did group question 1. So I don't know if we want to just do a little bit of recapping or just go. It seems like a lot of anxiety, and ours was about how to do both, kind of what we said. And I wanted Dave, you be able to talk about that part you said about leaving the window open longer. And I think that's really key to say everything doesn't have to change all at once, but it's a gradual process, and you can do something for 6 weeks and then say, no, we're going to do something else for the next 6 weeks, or however. I think part of what the pressure is feeling like you have to decide and then you have to stick with it, rather than, no, you have to decide what you're going to do in the next couple of weeks and then you can change it.
I think one of the things that leaders can do in this situation to keep the window open longer is the language we choose and what we talk about sets the tenor for a lot of the conversation in our congregations. And I know we have varying degrees of adversarial and collegial relationships, even in a congregation. So not every congregation is in the same spot, and not every person within the same congregation is in the same spot. That's where a lot of the conflict comes, is that person A thinks we should have been worshiping 6 months ago without masks and we're just cowardly chickens. And person B thinks when 3/4 of the group's vaccinated, we still shouldn't get back together quite yet, because not everybody's had a chance and it wouldn't be right. So, I mean, and those are two people who might live on the same street, go to the same congregation. So that reality is there. But I think leaders lead apart by setting tone and reminding people. I remember when the 2009 decision to allow the LGBTQ ordination happened, that the week after it happened, I was preaching on communion, and I decided to preach on the host. And I basically said, Lutherans have always said it doesn't matter who presides at communion, because it's not the presider's not the point, that we've had a different priestly model, that Jesus is the point. And that doesn't matter. We said years ago, it didn't matter whether it was a man or a woman who said it. So, and I sort of preempted a lot of the discussion, to be honest, in a way that kind of said that our theological piece supports this. And then we were able to have some pretty open conversations, and eventually about 2 years later became an RIC church. But I think leaders decide when you preach, when you talk, when you're at meetings, you set tone. And I think one of the things you can say now and should is, we're in a really big space. We're in a time of a lot of transition, and a lot of things stopped for a long time. And all of us are anxious to get back to normal because it makes it easier for us to function. But if we're serious about helping build the church of the future, this is the biggest window of opportunity we've ever had or ever will have. We dare not rush through it and put something in place that wasn't a good idea because we didn't take more time to think about a better one. Now, that doesn't mean we should be paralyzed and be thinking forever. But I think we just have to keep reminding people, imagine longer and implement slower, and that you don't have to implement everything once. I think you can say this over and over in 12 different ways to people, because people, me included, very few of us learn very much the first time we hear anything. And a lot of what we teach isn't really the content, but it's the atmosphere of space, atmosphere of openness. And so we have to allow our own anxiety not to dictate that I wish we could figure this out because I'm tired of it. And I'm overwhelmed and overburdened and burnt out or whatever, and set the tone that we can go more imaginatively and make more space. And to say, and part of this is going to be, we have to talk and listen to each other longer, build that dialogical, because really imagination and dialogue go together in a community. That if I can imagine a wonderful thing and I can't talk with people, then A, my imagination is narrower than it could be because it doesn't have their stuff, and B, it won't go anywhere because it doesn't get into their stuff, and vice versa. That imagination and dialogue, not selling my idea, but fermenting these things collegially, are really how adaptive space comes, because none of us knows what it's going to look like exactly. And that's one thing I would say. The more you can help people go slower, but imagine harder, spend more time dreaming, and don't be so anxious to put something down. And when you do know something, put it down, but don't think like you have to put, well, now we're doing this, we have to put ministry back. That's the thing we know. Go ahead and do that one, experiment with it, but you don't have to start the food pantry and the classes and restart confirmation and get the women's circles going again and everything else, whatever it is. Okay, that's the thing we feel confident in. Let's try it and see how it goes. 6-8 weeks from now, maybe we'll have another idea. We can try something else and add another step. Incremental re-entry will give people space to make better decisions.
Yeah, I like that incremental change, incremental re-entry, and framing it as a leader as you're emerging, how are you going to language it so that people understand that that's what you're doing? You're not trying to build the whole spaceship in one day. You're building it piece by piece. I wanted to hear Caleb report from his group, but also he has a question too. So, Caleb.
Thanks, Marge, and thanks, Dave. So in our group, we got through all three questions. We talked about that some of the anxieties really revolve around having enough people and having enough pastoral energy to work with what's happening. And we thought of some different things that are happening. Were very reminiscent of your presentation. That stuff is already going on, and thinking creatively, and how we foster adaptive thinking. But one of the sticking points that we didn't really know, and I was wondering if Dave could talk a little bit more about how in your 4 congregations in Elgin that worked together, like how did you overcome the congregational differences or animosities or competition, or were people actually excited about these collaborations, or was it just pastors who were excited about spreading the workload?
First of all, I would say we're in the midst of this conversation. That what I shared was the final product that we're dreaming of. It has not all happened yet.
Okay.
So that's the first thing. We actually still have 4 worship services that we all foster in different ways online. We're talking and working towards this. I don't know if we'll get there. Okay. This is just, I picked it because it's a place of my imagination that I think helps other people think about imagination, but it's what we're working on. We've not arrived. The second thing is we have arrived a little bit with education and so some of the Bible study, my wife leads a spiritual practices class on Thursday morning, and she has people from all 4 congregations participating routinely. So some of the educational pieces have happened. And we did an incredible job last summer with an interactive vacation Bible school program that all 4 congregations implemented, and it went very well. And we anticipate next Lent, we're going to work collaboratively. This year we had some mixes of more than 1 and 2, but next year we expect to have Lent and Advent things the way I described all there. I don't know if we'll ever get to 1 worship service online on Sunday. That's really the sticking point at this point. Holy Trinity's got a radio program they don't want to give up. And there's live streaming with video on the radio program. It's really a bad ministry. Functionally, in many ways, it's not good, but they don't want to give it up. So I don't know if they're a willing enough partner. People have to be willing to. There's no adaptive change without loss. We can make incremental change and add things and try and avoid grief. And we still don't. There's still grief always in a system. But you can't make an adaptive change without loss, because the new thing, by definition, has some substantive things that are different than the old thing. And so I think worship for us is going to be the real sticking point, because I don't think that every congregation is willing to give up its autonomy of worship, because we still think that's what the church is. We're actually Episcopalians in many ways in our pews, that we think worship is the thing. And it is a thing, but I think the church could be bigger than that. And we have to be willing to give that up. So Caleb, I would say we're like halfway down that path. And I don't know if the worship thing will ever happen, because I don't know if all 4 parties are willing to collaborate that much and lose that much of their online thing to say this is us, as opposed to this is collective us.
But it feels like now's the time to try that. You know, when especially if you've been doing Zoom worship or other formats where people aren't actually looking at their sanctuary. If that's not what they're used to looking at, you can change the view a bit. I don't know. It's an idea. Anybody else had good, I don't want just good. Has anybody else had experiences working with collaboration efforts that you've learned from that you could share for Caleb? Because I'm sure it wasn't just Caleb. But,
I'm just thinking, as I've been thinking about youth ministry, and we have just a handful of kids. That's an area where I could see the possibilities for collaboration, as well as education for adults, also for children and youth. I think especially youth, where you might have multiple churches feeding into 1 or 2 high schools. So they already have those outside connections.
Yeah, a lot of possibilities, but I'm just wondering if there's something. I know that Twin Valleys does a youth program like that. That sounds like it works well. Some congregations are not. Okay, sorry.
The reality is, I think discipleship,
Men's ministry and stuff too.
I think discipleship and education ministries and those kinds of things are probably the low hanging fruit, even though most congregations have thought most of their energy around being online for worship. That hybrid church isn't about being online for worship. It's about being intelligent about each aspect of ministry and using what's available to us to do it well. And I could see some congregations choosing not to have online worship in any way, shape, or form because they don't have the capacity and the numbers and the way it works, and still being a hybrid church because they chose to do discipleship or education or meetings or other things. That really, our mindset that if you have a church service and it's online, you're a hybrid church. I don't think that's really narrow thinking. I think it's, are we thinking intelligently about all of the ways that we could do our ministry? And is each of those aspects been thought through well? And is it way too much energy to keep 6 people online and we shouldn't do online worship anymore because it's just taking a lot of energy? Or is it really important that we stay online and we should do it well? That's an important decision. But you might make a different decision with regard to church council and its meeting or education or lots of other things. That the hybrid world, it permeates our entire church. Now I see Stephanie with a hand up.
I was going to call on.
Thanks. I did start reading through your book a little bit, and one of the areas that really struck me and challenged me is the call to use social media in ways that are engaging, right? I think we're all very good at using social media to let people know when our live stream services are. And so I just wanted to lift that up, or see if you might just say a little bit about your experience with doing more engaging social media, or what are some of the strategies that you found to be successful for both you yourself as a pastor, but also for your community as a whole? I'm trying to share that both the joy and the responsibility of doing engagement through social media.
Well, that's a whole big topic. I mean, in a sense, but I will say I did an hour workshop with the Alaska Synod last Saturday at their Synod Assembly on actually that topic. But I would say a couple of things that really help. One of the things that we've really struggled with in most mainline traditions, not just the ELCA, but most traditions, we've not done a good job at helping people tell their stories and articulate their faith so they can build their own vocabulary and share comfortably in interaction with other people about faith. And so one of the things I think social media provides is a lot of interaction and a chance to go viral. So you have to teach people how to use it. If I post something, let's say, I think memes are quite useful, but if I go on Google and look up Lutheran memes, they're mostly stupid. You might be a Lutheran if you put coffee in the budget. The force be with you, and also the Jedi in me says the force be with you. The Lutheran in me says and also with you. They're kind of inane, and they certainly wouldn't proclaim anything about grace or the transformation of the kingdom or any of the things that we might think are actually maybe useful. So I'm actually working with the evangelism team for the ELCA right now to cultivate a library of things we construct of intelligent Lutheran memes. They might be a Luther quote, a Bonhoeffer quote, a scripture passage, a baptismal theology piece, but short things that are actually content-based and I'll say pithy, and then with decent graphics and pictures so that they're, and that if I put something like that on my Facebook page at my congregation, I have to teach my congregation members then how to use social media. For example, if they click like, but they said, is Pastor Dave, that's great. Nice job. Oh, Pastor Dave, that's great. Well, that's nice to know, but it actually doesn't do anything. But if I can teach them, no, if you really want to help, share this. If you think this is interesting and other people might see it, then share it and get it to your timeline. And now it can go viral. So you have to teach people. A lot of people like and think they're just doing, actually liking's not doing anything of any great value. It changes the algorithm a little, but the real value is in sharing. So we have to teach. When I teach people, that's like, oh, I didn't know that. Well, they've been on Facebook for like 12 years and they've shared all kinds of stuff. They don't actually know how useful or not useful. They just do it. And mostly they like things. So we need to create a catalog. I think the most useful thing a congregation can do is post good content in accessible ways to teach churched people some substantive things about our own stuff and vocabulary, and allow them to interface with their social networks and others. That's a simple thing. I also think you have to post regularly and all kinds of things in terms of creating community. You have to create engagement, use questions, a lot of things. And there's probably people on here, who could work and go through a lot of stuff as well. So, but teaching people how to use it and how it works is a critical dimension. I see a hand from St. Mark's Lutheran, I think that is behind my arrow. Go ahead.
Yeah, hi, Jim Miracle. In that regards, one of the things I think that could be helpful is maybe in the larger church sense, or as you said, when you put together memes and content, that's something I think at either a synod or even the national level, potentially putting that content together. So, we have it at our fingertips. That's one of the challenges right now is, if you're not either you have to create your own content or you're really searching a lot for content. And, I do appreciate occasionally when something comes out from the national church that I can share. But being, like you said, intentional about stuff would be really helpful.
Yep. Marge, you got a hand.
Well, it's 5 after, so I want us to honor the time and wrap that up. But I'm assuming that everybody here is following or friends with, depending on what platform you're on, the ELCA or various versions of the ELCA subgroups, because they are all using Bible verse memes, Bonhoeffer quote memes, Luther quote memes. They all have them. So
you can find them. Absolutely, you can find them.
Yeah, they're there to find. If you go onto their Instagram pages, of course, that's easier because that's just all of the pictures that they've used. Anyway, that's great. Something I agree with Ray. Okay, sorry. I'm trying to do the chat, but we really aren't going to have time. But thank you, Dave.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yay. I hope everybody will come back next week for Ryan Penzer's conversation, Gigabytes and Grace. And if you want, like I said, if you want to do a book study through Dave's book, email me, mfunkpl@socalsynod.org, and we can put together a group for that. Breathe, rest. Doesn't have to happen today. Go slow and go in peace. Serve the Lord.
Be blessed, everybody. Thanks for the conversation.
Thank you.